learning opportunities. This presentation was co-designed with teachers as part of our Languages Advisory Network Group, or LANG. We'd like to thank Gillian from Terrigal High School and Jung Soo from Campsie Public School for working with us on this presentation. In this session, we aim to support you to enhance your understanding of what feedback is, the importance of providing feedback, the link between feedback, learning intentions, and success criteria, the difference between feedback and effective feedback, and strategies for providing effective feedback. Participation in this module contributes 30 minutes of registered professional learning against standard 6.2.2, which is participate in learning to update knowledge and practice targeted to professional needs and school and/or system priorities. We will add the slide deck to our statewide staff room in Yama and to our blog. So just sit back and relax. And as I mentioned, this session is also being recorded for any of your colleagues who couldn't make it today. What is feedback? Professor John Hattie and Professor Helen Timperley, in their journal article, The Power of Feedback, state that feedback is information provided by an agent regarding aspects of one's performance or understanding. The main purpose of feedback is to reduce discrepancies between current understandings and performance and a learning intentional goal. Think about it like this. Feedback is a key element of the teaching, learning, and assessment process, and when delivered effectively, it is a powerful way to achieve improvement in student outcomes. Feedback provides evidence about student learning related to learning intentions and success criteria. This then helps us to understand the effectiveness of our teaching and, if needed, where to adapt strategies to better meet the needs of our students. Feedback is designed to bring out an improvement in students' performance and enable students to close the gap between their current understanding and the end of unit learning intentions and success criteria. Why is feedback important?
By the way, you're going to get an influx of bills.
Feedback is integral to teaching, learning, and assessment, as it can clarify for students how to close the gap between where they are now in their learning and where they need to get to, how their knowledge, understanding, and skills are developing in relation to the syllabus outcomes and content being addressed, how to recognise their strengths and areas for development. According to CC's What Works Best 2020 update, feedback is a core component of teaching practice, intersecting with learning, assessment, and reporting. It is central to the assessment and reporting requirements of New South Wales syllabuses and a key aspect of Standard 5 of the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. Feedback is also one of the themes of effective classroom practice in the School Excellence Framework.
And put in name and the school that you come from.
Learning intentions and success criteria both form the basis of any feedback. Learning intentions ensure all students know what they are going to learn, and success criteria ensure all students know what the end goal for this learning is. Here are some sample learning intentions. These are from our class party unit for Stage 4. Learning intentions should be shared with students at the start of each unit of work. You can see the learning intentions provide a clear set of statements which clarify your expectations for students. You should also provide students with a final assessment of learning task at the start of a unit, so students know the end destination, as well as the journey. By providing students with a copy of the final assessment task at the start of a unit, you're identifying their success criteria for them. They just need to look at what achievement at grade A looks like. Some students may need these unpacked further, and we'll look at this later in the presentation when we look at progress charts. When to give feedback. Feedback can occur at any point during the teaching, learning, and assessment cycle. Ideally, feedback takes place during the learning as students work on classroom activities. This allows time for students to make improvements along the way. This is often more effective and productive to the learning experience than end-of-task feedback measures. Too often, feedback that is provided to students after learning has concluded is not used by the students to improve their work. This often results in teachers making the same comments over and over again and wondering why the student has not transferred the information to another context. For such feedback to influence subsequent learning, students must remember it, translate it into advice that is transferable across tasks, and apply it the next time they encounter a task in which this learning could apply. Forms of feedback. Feedback can take many forms. Oral feedback is sometimes underestimated because it can be perceived as less formal, but it can be a very powerful and effective tool as it can be provided easily in the teachable moment and in a timely way during a lesson. Oral feedback could also be given via conversations with individual students after an assessment task. Some students may be more engaged with a discussion rather than having to read your comments. Written feedback provides students with an ongoing record of what they are doing well, what needs improvement, and suggested next steps. Evaluative feedback is a summary for the learner of how well he or she has performed on a particular task. We often give this type of feedback after an assessment of learning task. Informal feedback, such as check-ins and exit slips, can be used to see how students are progressing and usually occurs during the learning. Formal feedback is often written or a combination of oral and written and usually occurs at the end of a task. Peer feedback occurs when students offer each other advice and suggestions in relation to each other's work. We'll look at this in more detail in a moment. Self-assessed feedback empowers students to take charge of their own learning, a necessary skill for lifelong learning. We'll look at some examples of this too. Let's look closely at what makes feedback effective. Firstly, it's goal-oriented. Linking your feedback to the learning intentions and success criteria supports students to have a greater understanding of what they are learning and the end goal of this learning. Focus on 3 key feedback questions. What are the goal or goals? What progress are you making towards the goal or goals? And what do you need to make the progress better? Effective feedback is also timely. It needs to be given while there is still time for the student to act on it and to adjust their own learning. When they receive feedback while their efforts are still fresh in mind, it will have its greatest impact. Effective feedback is consistent. Students need ample and regular opportunities to use feedback, and the feedback you provide must be explicit, accurate, and trustworthy. It's student-friendly. Feedback is not of much value if students cannot understand it or feel overwhelmed by it. Avoid using jargon or unnecessary technical language. It is important that feedback is individualized and adjusted based on students' readiness. For example, an appropriate amount of feedback for one student might not be enough for another and might overwhelm a third. An encouraging positive tone will also go far in supporting students to accept your feedback and achieve their learning goals. It's task-focused. Providing feedback means giving students an explanation of what they are doing correctly and incorrectly in relation to the task or activity. By focusing on the work and not the student, students are more likely to open to what you're saying. Finally, it's actionable. Ensure your feedback delivers clear, specific details so that your students immediately know how to take action and how to better move toward the learning goal. Your comments should be balanced and clearly identify their strengths and areas for improvement. This will help students see exactly what they've done well, repeat good habits in the future, and feel motivated and challenged to further develop their knowledge and skills. Ensure students not only understand the feedback and the steps they need to take moving forward, but are given time and opportunity to do so. The 2-part structure. Even when you are pushed for time, for example, when you are providing informal feedback to students as you walk around your classroom, your feedback can still be explicit and effective. One of the simplest approaches to giving feedback is the 2-part structure. Commenting on what they did, preferably something they have done well if you can, and how they could improve. Let's take a look. I'll just give you a moment to read that. The first comment doesn't always have to be positive. It can be a statement of fact, such as, "You did not complete the task." In this case, the next comment on how they could improve would be something like, "Read back over the task and then bring me a list of questions I can help you with." Effective feedback is tailored to the needs and abilities of individual students, so it will vary from student to student. And remember, your feedback should always focus on the student's work and not the student themselves. For example, rather than saying, "Try a little harder," be explicit by saying, "Try and include a reason that you like your little brother." Success criteria are most effective when students have a clear understanding of what success looks like, or even when they identify their own success criteria. Here's an example. WAGOL stands for what a good one looks like. Consider this model text in Spanish. The teacher provides a text with the good bits highlighted. Students then work in pairs to create their own success criteria based on the highlighted text. Once the students finish, they then discuss their criteria with another pair. By giving students the option to surprise me at the bottom, it allows more creative or able students to research better constructions or bring previous vocabulary back to the forefront. Providing students with work samples clarifies and communicates quality. Here is a similar activity with the support taken away. These Stage 4 students were simply handed a text, and there was a class discussion about what they would need to look for in order for it to achieve a higher grade. Students were given 10 minutes to complete annotations on the text with the aim of them feeding back and eventually producing their own text. Despite their limited studies of the language, the teacher was happy that the students had the ability to recognize tenses and include them in their own work. Digital student portfolios are an effective way for students to maintain a permanent record of their learning journey and for teachers to track and assess student growth. A digital portfolio is a great way to foster independence while encouraging reflection and lifelong learning. By using the suggestion mode within a Google Doc, teachers can provide feedback and suggestions to students. The feedback can be accepted and easily incorporated into the students' work without them having to physically rewrite their answers. In addition to Google Docs, OneNote is another digital tool that is easy to give feedback and suggestions to students in. Just like with writing, you can also unpack success criteria with listening activities and tasks. In this example, which is for Stage 6, the teacher used sample answers from previous cohorts to help students make sense of marking guidelines and understand the requirements of a task. By selecting strong and weak examples of past students' work, keeping them anonymous of course, you can ask students to discuss, analyse, and mark them in class using the marking guide. You can have a class discussion as to why the answers were awarded the grade they were. Provide examples of different styles to show that creativity and diversity are welcome. Voice recording apps for speaking practice are a useful tool for students to develop their speaking skills in the target language. Practice speaking sessions, including feedback, are recorded and uploaded to an online file storage service such as Google Drive. This is an effective, formative feedback strategy as it occurs during the learning, allowing students the time to reflect on feedback given, identify their strengths and weaknesses, and target areas that need work prior to a summative assessment task. It encourages partnerships between the teacher and students, increases student motivation, and supports students being accountable for their own learning. OneNote has a feature that enables you to record audio, so this would also be an ideal tool to use to provide oral feedback to students. Ineffective feedback. Avoid giving students ineffective feedback. Ineffective feedback includes giving marks or grades without comment, making comparisons to other students, extrinsic rewards, non-specific or general feedback, giving feedback unrelated to critical aspects of learning goals, overloading students with too much or too technical information, giving too much written feedback, associating what next with more, giving feedback when students lack knowledge or information. Let's look at practical samples for peer feedback. Giving feedback is an art, so don't expect your students to be able to give each other effective feedback until you've given them some guidance first. Firstly, always model what good feedback looks like. Remind them that they don't need to give feedback on everything all at once, and discuss how this can be overwhelming and therefore ineffective. Make sure the feedback they give is explicit and actionable. And consider using templates. We'll take a look at some now. Remember, you can also ask students to provide anonymous feedback to each other too, which might be a good way to start. 2 stars and a wish is an easy formative assessment strategy to implement in the classroom for those students new to peer feedback. Students are given a slip of paper with a picture of 2 stars and a wand. Next to the stars, students write a positive aspect of their peers' work, and next to the wand, they provide one constructive comment, a wish, about what the peer might do next time in order to improve another aspect of their work. In order for this strategy to be successful, the feedback must be linked to the task criteria, and it is recommended that the teacher model this strategy several times using samples of student work before asking the students to use the strategy in pairs on their own. The teacher can then ask pairs who have implemented the strategy successfully to demonstrate it to the whole group. The task pictured above required students to promote an Australian town to Japanese people to encourage them to visit Australia. The students were required to design a mascot that would represent the region and write a description that outlined the features of the town using the grammatical structures and vocabulary presented in the topic. When providing feedback to their peers, students need to consider the following. Does the mascot effectively represent the region you are promoting? Is the text structured in a logical order, and does it contain all required content? Have you used the targeted vocabulary and structures from the topic? Are the targeted vocabulary and structures used accurately? Have you used the correct script throughout the task? Another simple strategy to encourage learners to take more responsibility for their own learning and seek peer feedback is by using the C3 before me strategy. Nope, I'm going back. Sorry, I just missed a slide. With the plus and minus and what's next feedback model, students can comment on what was done well in relation to the success criteria and also on what could be done better. The task pictured above required students to create a series of social media style screenshots and videos capturing different activities that they do throughout the week. By seeking advice from peers through plus, minus, what's next on a task such as this, students are asked to make adjustments and incorporate feedback prior to submitting the task to the teacher. Another simple strategy to encourage learners to take more responsibility for their own learning and seek peer feedback is by using the C3 before me strategy. This simply means that learners must seek 3 sources of peer feedback before seeing the teacher. The template pictured here can be accessed on the department's Digital Learning Selector website, as can a range of other peer feedback templates. Now, let's take a look at how students can provide their own effective feedback to themselves. A progress chart is a way for students to map their progress against the learning intentions and success criteria. Often, it helps to break down the learning intentions and success criteria into parts, as you can see here. After students complete the progress charts, you can ask students to add a reflection statement or action plan on how they will achieve the things they need to do and where they will go for help. For example, the teacher, peers, dictionary, or an online search. Here's a class version of a progress chart, which is another option you may like to consider. Whilst it's for English, it shows you how it works with students writing their initials under how they feel. Another useful strategy in supporting students to be responsible for their own learning is to only give them half the normal feedback and then ask them to do the rest. For example, you can comment throughout a piece of work and then students write their own summative comment. Consider the following. Or you can flip this and only write the summative comment yourself, and then the student uses this to go back and edit their own work. Student learning journals provide a place for students to plan, set goals, and write reflections, helping them to develop their language skills. The use of student learning journals also assists students with their organisational skills and with developing a growth mindset. Guiding questions for the student learning journal may include, what have I learnt this week? What do I need to do for next week? What do I need help with? You may also want to include information on how they can use their own learning. We have provided an online sample self-reflection guide for students on our website, which you can see on the slide. I'll come back to this at the end of today's presentation. This is a sample of how you can bring a range of feedback together. I'm sure many of you use this technique already. I'll just give you a moment to read it. As you can see, this technique includes student assessment, teacher response, student response, and a parent-carer comment. Involving parents and carers in this process provides them with feedback about their child's learning progress and has been shown to be effective in improving student achievement. Where to next? Take some time after this presentation to do some self-reflection. Consider how you have been providing feedback to students. Is it timely, consistent, and actionable? Is it task-focused and goal-oriented? Are there different feedback strategies you would like to incorporate into your teaching? What kind of feedback strategies would your students engage in? How will you engage your students in feedback strategies? Example, time, scaffolds, discussions on feedback. Teachers can reflect on the quality of their feedback with these questions. Do I give clear, concise feedback related to the learning intentions? Do I identify what was done well and what needs improvement? Does my feedback include how students can improve? Do I expect my students to act on my feedback? Do I provide the necessary time for students to act on the feedback? Do I follow up on the feedback? Before we finish today, I'd like to let you know that we have just published 3 new resources to support you with feedback on our website. The URL is on the slide and one of my colleagues will just paste it into the chat now so you can take a look. Click on Feedback at the top of the page and it will take you to the correct section. We have a guide for providing feedback, one for peer feedback, and one for student learning journals. This is where you will also find the online sample self-reflection guide for students, which I mentioned earlier. If you'd like to learn more about feedback, please take a look at the ATSL website and CC's What Works Best document. Links for both are on the screen and we'll paste them in the chat too. As we finish today, here's the last thing we'd like to say. What questions do you have? Is a much more effective question than any questions? So, what questions do you have? We'll be here for another 5 minutes or so to answer any questions, or if you feel like a chat about today's presentation, you can write your questions in the chat or unmute yourself for those leaving us now. And I'd like to thank you for joining us and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Chanel.
Thank you.
Just going to apologise to Chanel that I was looking a bit off task. A massive,
Oh, I didn't notice.
a massive branch fell off the tree in
Oh.
the backyard and knocked on the back fence. So there's now side driveway with everyone looking at it. So,
Oh.
sorry.
No, it's all good. And from this end, you don't know if anyone's paying attention or not. You can actually just sit here and no one would know. It's
It was
okay.
fantastic.
Thanks, Jodie.
So much, Chanel. That was really nice.
Really good.
What questions or comments does anyone have?
Yep. Anne-Marie says, can we get a copy of your PowerPoint? Yes.
Yes, so
Yeah.
the PowerPoint and the recording will go up later this week or early
Yep.
next week. And that will go up on the blog and in our statewide staff room in Yammer. And the video will also be on YouTube. Can I just get one of the languages and culture team members just to paste the AITSL and CESI links into the chat? Okay, so Rebecca's got a question about rubrics. So Rebecca, would you just want to unmute yourself? Might be the easiest way, and just ask away.
Yep, hi. So I noticed that some of the sample tasks on the department website have rubrics that are kind of criteria based rather than the usual standards reference that we'll see in a lot of other subjects. So I was just wondering if there was more, I don't know, if there was kind of like a trend towards moving towards criteria-based assessment rubrics. I'm noticing it a lot in the language assessment tasks.
So we usually put up both. So if you look at them, we have version A, which is outcomes based, and then we have version B, which is a holistic approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to pop a link in the chat for you, which sort of explains the difference. It's really kind of what meets the needs of your students best. Obviously, the HSC is marked in a holistic way, and so we want to make sure that students are aware or are familiar with that approach. But as teachers are sort of starting on the marking guidelines journey or the rubrics journey, sometimes they prefer to have it as outcomes based. So it really depends on you. It depends on the needs of your students. But that link I've just popped in the chat pod is a really good article that explains the difference.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. We at school we have some faculties that are experimenting with moving towards like the criteria-based rubrics and using that as a form of feedback as well. So I just thought it was really interesting that on the department's website, that you guys had that available. Whereas other subjects I've noticed in their assessment tasks, they only have the outcomes-based rubric. So I just thought it was interesting.
Probably the main reason we started doing it that way is because we're finding, very understandably, this is not a criticism, but we're finding that because the syllabuses are still relatively new in K to 10, some teachers are struggling with, say, the difference between 4C, which is the composing outcome, and which looks at experimenting with linguistic patterns and structures, compared to, say, 6U, and I'm talking about non-scripted, which is applies features of grammatical structures and sentence patterns. So because they're quite overlappy, we found that it was, as a professional learning kind of approach, to say to teachers, well, this is what 4C looks like across the 5 grades, and this is what 6U looks like across the 5 grades, so that you could get a sense of what are we looking at when we assess 5C and what are we looking at when we assess 6U. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. I do find that the outcomes do tend to overlap, so breaking it down as much as possible, I think, is really helpful just for me as a teacher as well. Because we're so used to thinking in the HSC modes, and then shifting between juniors and then HSC, you do see like an overlap with the new syllabus outcomes, I find.
Yeah, and that's certainly what we're hoping comes out of. We're not NESA, so we don't control the curriculum. Our role is to implement it and support schools in implementing and maintaining the curriculum. But our hope with the curriculum review is that there is a much stronger alignment between the K to 10 and stage 6 content, so that, you know, you don't have to I think a lot of teachers at the moment feel like they have to take their K to 10 hat off when they're in with their continuous students, because there's a bit of a difference between those syllabuses. So hopefully that will be resolved in the coming years. We will wait and see.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
You're welcome.